They need to see the Christian prioritize what actually happened accurately. And that is, we need to fix that you were hurt first. Then we'll talk about the theology.
Anna is a cult and new religion specialist with Ratio Christi, where she serves as the campus apologist at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. She's also a therapist who specializes in religious trauma and exit counseling of high control groups. She has a YouTube channel where you can find lots of information that she's put out there that we'll link in the show notes. I'm just so excited to have you here and be doing this with you.
Oh, this is fun. I love this stuff, man. Especially when I can talk to someone who knows what I'm talking about and isn't intimidated by, that interchange, that intersection between psychology and apologetics.
And no, I'm just intimidated by the volume of your hair. That's it. Other than that.
Yeah. This is toned down. I keep trying to do this.
I get so flat. I'm like, stay. Oh, actually, that did something.
Yeah, no, it's cute. Your face is the right shape though. Mine, when it's flat, man, it looks terrible.
Oh, it's funny. Okay, let's just jump right in. First question. When an individual leaves a religiously abusive situation, they are often left feeling isolated in that experience, kind of like what you just said. People don't necessarily understand, and yet they're far from alone. There's so many people out there. In your experience and from your education, how prevalent do you think this really is?
Super, super prevalent, in the sense that I think people feel an inordinate level of shame when it has to do with like spiritual trauma. And I haven't quite isolated exactly why that is, but it seems to be something folks are a little bit more quiet about than they would otherwise be. It may be because they're worried that it'll impact the guru or whoever it was that they escaped. It could be that they don't really know how to assess the theology and how bad it was. And so they just kind of lump it all into, this was just an overall bad experience and I don't know how to isolate it from other traumas. And so therapists are interested in clinical trauma. And this isn't a clinical trauma, in my opinion, right? Because they don't know. And so then they don't seek out the help that they might normally seek out because they can't quite identify the difference between what they would think of as like medical trauma, like a typical PTSD type scenario, and what they experienced, even though it's the same. It's just in a different, it's just in a setting that they're not used to seeing that sort of thing in. So I think that may be part of the isolation aspect to it. It's also a lot of times their religious experiences were odd, and they realize that coming out of the group, but they don't know quite how to navigate the world anymore. A lot of these groups are charismatic, in their orientation, and they don't know how to talk to people about, what it was that they experienced, that there were levels of false prophecies that ended them where they are. And so the shame, again, there's like, I really get that there's a shame element that they're not sure how to navigate, not realizing that they've been completely and totally abused, and that coercive persuasion is really genuinely something that is a clinically and let's call it analyzable. I don't know if that's a word, but we can really break it down and we can really talk about it, and we know a lot more than people realize. So
yes, that shame piece comes up in every conversation in one way, shape, or form. And I remember feeling that way myself.
Yeah.
Because I felt crazy in my own experience of, but all of this did happen, but then none of that happened. And so there's these like different compartments of like, these things were said, but they actually kind of did align. And then these things very obviously did not. And this doesn't match the world outside of my home. And so in that kind of some of the cognitive dissonance and a lot of the gaslighting that can go on as we're actually stepping away and we're looking back at our experiences and feeling crazy myself, that really got in the way of being able to share my experience, because I myself was like, I don't even know what to do with it, let alone be able to defend myself to someone else, which is what it would feel like. It's like, we'll have to defend this because they're going to be like, how on earth did you believe this? And yet people aren't as exempt from such an experience as they may think. And I don't want to say that to scare people, but mind control, undue influence, like these kinds of things that we talk about, they're very real and they're powerful. I mean, look at marketing, you know, look at kids when in commercials, and all of a sudden, I mean, my son, he's like every 5 seconds, oh, I want that. I want that. Can you buy me this? Can you buy me that? And it's just a very simple, harmless example of what influence can do to someone.
Yeah, and just in breaking down the you know, you can, it's aggressive, but it does the trick a bit, I think, and at least I find with my clients, that you can kind of make it equivalent to like the rape of the mind as opposed to the body. And you're experiencing exactly the same emotions for both pieces, but they don't know how to articulate what happened to them because it was mental. And don't get me wrong, a lot of these are more than mental, and in most cases they are, I would say. But in the cases where it's a coercive persuasion case, and this is something that a guru has stolen, 20, 25 years of their life and all of their finances, and they see what happened to them as, oh, well, I guess I was just duped. Like, maybe I'm more gullible than other people, and so it's really just my fault. And in a lot of these cases, that's not true in the slightest, and they're just living in this self-imposed prison their whole lives, just thinking that, this is something I should have seen coming. I shouldn't have been taken advantage in this way, and that's not how coercive control works.
Right. Right. Absolutely. And again, we see it in so many different forms, but there's something about this context of religious trauma, religious abuse, cult abuse,
Mhm.
specifically at times, where the stigma is still stronger than it is for other forms.
Mhm.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah, yeah, I can see that. And with the looseness with which those words are thrown around sometimes, especially in religious circles, like the word cult, I have to educate all the time that word. I'm not using that in the sense that groups that Anna doesn't like. Right. It's we have a formalized definition, and we can analyze these things with a bite model and see how significant is the control here, and what precisely are they preaching, and how is it different than whatever religion they're claiming to be a part of, which can be really, really powerful in making those distinctions and just educating people enough to realize that you can get cult-ish, right, with these kind of standalone groups. The podcasts, cultures podcasts, they talk about that sometimes. And the point is the education aspect, because these terms are thrown around so loosely that I think people are afraid when you're really coming to talk to somebody who's a clinician, that you might be railroaded or you might look dumb, and it's never something we would ever actually do to someone. But I worry that they fear that, and so they don't come for help when they could.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. For those who are unfamiliar, we go based on the bite model as well. And then we have, when we're looking at a cultish group, or something that's a spin-off, not quite in alignment with Christianity itself, we also bring in the doctrinal piece,
Right.
which isn't really so much in the bite model. So that's something that we have that we look at in addition to.
Right.
But for those who are unfamiliar, who are listening to us today, would you mind just running through the bite model so that they have an idea of what we're talking about?
Sure, sure. The bite model was developed by Stephen Hassan, who came out of the Moonies in the 1980s. He's a non-religious clinician, but was trying to formalize some way to figure out exactly how undue influence could be quantified. And he was studying materials that were coming out of like Maoist China in the 1950s, when we were looking at POWs who were able to be controlled, and trying to differentiate between what they were experiencing in a brainwashing type way, where brainwashing exists when you know your enemy and you're trying to get away from the pain that they're causing you. And so you'll do anything that they want to get away from the pain. That's technically brainwashing. Whereas there's coercive persuasion, and that's when the same thing is happening to you, but you can't tell that it's an enemy doing it to you. It's perceived as a friend who's doing it. And so you never can escape that positive feedback loop in your mind, because you never know that you're dealing with an enemy. That's coercive control. So those are the two distinctions. A bite model comes down the middle, and it analyzes a group for how significantly they control behavior. That's the B. How significantly they control the flow of information. That's the I. The T stands for thinking, and then the E stands for emotions. So we want to see just how comprehensive is this group? How much liberty do you have as an individual? How many things are you having to forfeit in your life in order to belong to the group, to feel secure? Can you exit reasonably? Have they taken control of your entire life such that even if you desired to exit, you really couldn't? Do they withhold your family members? All of these little details really, really matter in analyzing the group. And then on top of that, people like you and I who incorporate apologetics into our clinical practice, then past that point, then we look at the theology. And so in the States, we are primarily dealing with Christian-ish, Christianese using groups. And so we look at how significantly they've altered the theology from Orthodox Christianity. And that gives us a comprehensive picture of what we're dealing with, what we can expect, the type of PTSD we might be looking for. Have they dissociated? The stuff that, when you're going through your DSM and you're trying to figure out your diagnostic codes for what to send off to insurance, all that stuff, those details really matter for precisely the type of therapy you want to put your clients through. So that's why the bite model is so helpful, is that it removes the subjective aspects to it and makes it quantifiable and a way that you can teach your client exactly what happened to them.
Absolutely. It is such a helpful tool, and I appreciate his work so much. So thank you for giving us an explanation of it. But with that in mind, Anna, when you're talking about high control groups, are you typically equating that with a cult in your mind when you're saying it?
Yes. So the beauty, so high control groups, they are the ones, a third party, an outside source to you is dictating specifically how you are to behave. And these are humans who are doing the dictating, right? It's not doctrine that's doing the dictating. These are humans who have had their own specific version of how they want to see things operate, how they want you to look, how they want you to feel, how they want you to spend your time. All those things are being dictated to you. Those are high control groups. They're very, very, very common. They normally start out as standalone groups that, somebody wanted to plant a church somewhere, and that person maybe wasn't trained as much into the theology. And so they get bogged down in the difference between justification and sanctification, and the sanctification goes haywire. And then they start having like really nuanced opinions that you can't find scripture for, and those opinions trickle down, and then you've got like a pyramid starts building where you've got the guru at the top and his main guys who follow them, and then all their spouses, and it gets really weird really fast. And then all of a sudden, your name is your new group's called the Remnant, and there's going to be a compound in the woods. Like it goes crazy quickly very often. But sometimes it's not as obvious. Sometimes it's just a ton of social pressure. And so you get into the group, and all of a sudden, like you're looking around, and there's a lot of social engineering that's happening in services. And then everybody looks and speaks the same way. I joke all the time with people. I was like, remember years ago in the evangelical movement when like every girl had to carry a Kavu backpack? Remember that?
I
Like
probably missed that. I think I was still in the cult. It wasn't a thing. I don't know what that is.
Yeah, maybe. So it's a backpack with only one strap, and it's made for hiking. They're super cute. I joke, but like I joke that that's how it starts, right? Everybody starts looking the same and having the same, and it's kind of Stepford in their own little nuanced way. And like it's like that's when you start going, okay, somebody has too much control over the independence of these individuals such that they feel compelled to all look the same. This deserves some investigation. It doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong. It's worthy of investigating why exactly everybody starts sounding the same and using the same vocabulary. Like that's how it begins, right? So we start looking for the red flags.
Yeah. Gosh, that's funny. And then if you notice someone like me in your middle school who doesn't check any of the boxes of normalcy, that's also maybe a reason to ask questions.
Absolutely.
So, go ahead.
I was going to say you had, so my friends, how I got started was with the Jehovah's Witnesses. I had friends in the Jehovah's Witnesses, and I was a Lutheran kid, and it was like, y'all are so odd in the sense that they can't do anything. And then you would ask them like why it was they couldn't do some of the stuff, and they were taking their scriptures seriously, but their Bible was different from everybody else's. And so it's little things like that that you want to start investigating. Okay, exactly what's going on, because the truth doesn't ever flee from scrutiny. So more questions should never be a bad thing. And when questions are a bad thing, that's when you should start to fret that maybe you're not in a group that is being truthful.
Yes. Yes. And I love the way you just put that so much, because in direct conflict, my upbringing, and I hear this over and over and over again from different clients who come from different backgrounds. So not the same group, not even a splinter of the same group, just totally different. But education is considered bad. It can be considered evil. The more educated you become, the further you get from God, the less you're going to realize the truth. It's like education is sort of like, quote unquote, of this world. And that's not good. You don't want to be of this world, which is, again, taking scripture out of context and what it
Right.
really means by being, in the world, but not of it. And so questions were considered bad. Becoming educated was considered bad. Going to college was bad, especially for women, which is another topic, but even more so, just needing that male headship. But even the men were discouraged. It would be more like trade school just so they could provide well enough. And so it's such a direct conflict to how I was raised, but it is 100% true that if it's true, it's going to stand up and we're going to find it.
Right.
If God is real, we'll find him as we're
Right.
searching. If we're
Exactly.
genuinely of, okay, where's the evidence going to lead us? And that's why we have incredible people like Lee Strobel who convert, who are
Right.
angry and don't want it to be true. And they're like, okay, I'm going to take a look at it. And they're like, oh crap, I didn't mean for that to happen.
Exactly.
Because the truth is going to be the truth. And so you don't have to be afraid. Now, sometimes I hear fear about investigating because there's fear that what we believe will be found to be untrue.
Right.
And I understand that emotion as well. And I
Mhm.
certainly had some of that for myself, which ultimately what I had been raised in that worldview was actually untrue. But of course, there was fear attached to that because then I have to deal with all that is going to come from that realization. I have to
Right.
reframe everything. I have to deal with who were these people and what decisions did I make and why, and I made them incorrectly, and how could life have been different, and the losses that come. There's so much that comes with it. And yet the decision I made was truth is worth it. I value it highly enough to deal with the consequences because I believe that ultimately the consequences are going to be good.
Right.
Even if they're hard, I believe they're ultimately good. And that's a decision for everyone to make independently.
Exactly, exactly right. And as you would know as well as anybody, that when we're dealing with clients, one of the things you have to teach them is we have the right as individuals to self-determination. You don't have to pursue knowledge. Like you get to determine how you want to spend your time on this side of the veil. And the Lord, if he loves you, which we teach that he does in Christianity, and for the most part, folks would say, yeah, I believe the Lord loves me, then why would he desire for you to live in fear?
Mhm.
So it's a decision. You're right. Something that we have to decide to do to, open up the scriptures and determine, just how much of this do we actually know, which is a big deal because
Mhm.
biblical literacy is very, very low in my experience. Um, but how much do we really know about what we believe? And then are we ready to challenge beliefs that are false? And do we really want to? And that's a big decision,
Mhm.
big decision.
Yes. And for anyone who's listening who has not had an experience such as what we're talking about today, it might seem like this, oh, it's not even a question. Like, of course you would want to know and you want to investigate. But this leads me into our next question. I've already mentioned a couple of things as I was rattling off that list, but oh, I just clicked the wrong tab. Let me pull it back up.
No worries.
So, what common challenges have you seen individuals face as they step into healing and in many ways start a new life? And I want to tie this into what you just said because it's not an easy decision because there are very real, substantial consequences that come from it. And again, I don't necessarily mean consequences always being negative. They can be good, they can be bad, they can just be hard, they could be
Mhm.
good and difficult. But it's not as simple as one may think who hasn't lived it themselves.
Yeah, you have to be prepared, at least in my experience. And we warn our clients all the time that they are going to have to deconstruct what was built incorrectly. And I mean deconstruction not in the philosophical and kind of the loose philosophical way it's being thrown around culturally right now. I mean literally in a psychological deconstruction of belief, where they're having to challenge things that they thought were set pillars of their entire lives, to really make sure that that is something that's truthful. And the deconstruction process can lead to the intense bitterness, cynicism, depression. And the hard part too is if they're still around others who are in the group, but they've stepped away, the panic that ensues in their group, in their life, in their families, and their friends, when they start really challenging pivotal parts of their faith that sound like they might be becoming more agnostic than Christian for a minute. And so we have to warn our clients that this is a personal process. Be patient and kind for all of the people who love you who are going to start panicking as you start challenging all these things. Try not to lash out. It's okay. We're in a growing season, but let's go ahead and take a sledgehammer to everything that's false, and then we'll see what remained and make sure that this process is done right. The Lord doesn't build on idols, you know? So sometimes you got to knock down a whole lot of stuff to get back to brass tacks. And sometimes you find out there was no foundation at all, and the foundation has to be laid. So that can be very scary. But as far as anticipating as clinicians, helping them anticipate what this is going to look like when I set up that that's a thing, and they're going to voluntarily step in and face the unknown and face what could be complete and total tragedy. They voluntarily do so. In them doing that, that's prolonged exposure therapy already that they're doing for themselves. That's making them braver, and that's precisely the type of therapy we want to do anyway.
Mhm.
So anticipating, and making sure that the expectations are real, I think is really, really, really powerful. And it's playing the long game, don't get me wrong, but that's the game you want to play here because you're dealing with truth. So they'll get there. The emotions on the way may get complicated, but that's okay.
Mhm. Yes, it is absolutely a journey that takes time.
Yeah.
Yes. And I remember at one point I had a therapist who I'm so thankful for, because it can be very challenging to find a qualified therapist in this area.
Right.
I'm not saying they don't exist. I'm talking to you right now. You
No,
exist.
no, you're exactly right. The amount of therapy I have to
Mhm.
do to undo whatever the therapist before was doing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's tough. And so I had someone though who told me, was very upfront, and I appreciated the directness. He had said to me, you're very high functioning, like you've built a life, like you don't have to do this if you don't want to. No one would ever know. So it's really about if you're fine or not.
Hmm.
And it was a really honest reflection back, was just a really valid question. And I decided it was a new, like deeper level that I needed to go to, like a deeper level of just healing that I had to work through, as much as the word work isn't always best in this scenario. But I was like, oh, this is going to be tough. Do I even want to go there? Do I even kind of want to open that box and go there? But in relation to becoming a parent, I did. And so that was my motivator.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm someone who in general likes to handle things because I want to be as healed as I can be on this side of eternity. But I recognize I'm never going to 100% arrive somewhere. At the
Right.
same time, well, if there's something else I can do that's going to help me be a better mom to my little guy and help me feel more attached and to love him better and be more present. And I mean that literally in a not dissociative way of like
Right. Right.
literally
Right.
be, then yeah, of course I want to do that, even though it's hard. And those are really good questions for people to ask themselves. Something that I always ask is, what is the motivation? Like, what is your motivator? Knowing your why for this can be really powerful to write down and come back to, because there's going to be weeks where you just don't want to do it. And you can take those weeks off too. That's okay. But it's helpful to know when we are willingly going to go through something that's difficult, why we're choosing to do it to begin with.
Right. Right. And that's really just worldview analysis too. You're helping them process like precision process. What is it that they're doing with their time? Right. We're the only people that get to hear what goes on in our heads at 3 a.m. when everybody else is asleep. What would you like to hear?
Mhm.
And that's a huge question, and sometimes a question they don't know how to answer yet, and you have to walk them through, you know, some of the
Yeah.
things that they like, especially coming out of high control groups, because you kind of lose a sense of who you are.
Yes.
I've had a lovely moments. Remember the movie Runaway Bride with
Hmm.
Julia Roberts, where she
Hmm.
has to go figure out what kind of eggs she likes?
Yes.
So I use that as an analogy. It's like, if we don't even know what you like for breakfast, let's figure that out first.
Hmm.
Right? Let's isolate some things that are specific to you so that you can figure that out, because half the time they have no idea who they are coming out of these
Right.
groups. So how could
Right.
they possibly know what they want?
Well, and I was having a conversation actually recently with my husband because I said, there's some terms that I use. So let me know if you use something differently, but some terms that I use, and I know some others do in the mental health professional community, that hint of other worldviews.
Mhm,
So, like the idea of genuine self or authentic self.
mhm.
And I'm like, okay, is there a different term I can use, or do I just have to define it every time I use it? Because I'm not talking about this in like a new age kind of way, or any other sort of worldview way that we could be using this. I'm not elevating the self over the Godhead. I'm not doing any of those things. This is literally about someone who doesn't know what kind of eggs they like.
Yes.
Someone who literally has no idea what they think, feel, desire, what their skills are, because they've always been so indoctrinated as to what they look like and who they're
Yes.
supposed to be. That's what I'm talking about.
Yes. No, that's exactly what I do. I call it word vomiting philosophizing, because that my professor would call it philosophizing randomly, back in the day. And that was just like, I just want to clarify all the things that are not happening while I'm telling you what we're focusing on that could be confused. In theology, you can play with it as like, this is apophatic therapy, right? We're going to tell you all the things this is what I'm not saying. And
Mm-hmm.
then you can try to isolate what that means for you, and we can try to figure out precision how to articulate it. But no, that's exactly what I do. So that's
Yeah.
awesome. I love
Glad
that.
I'm not alone.
No, I don't know how else to do it.
I
You know,
know.
if only we could read minds, be a whole
I
different
know. Or
world.
we just have to coin all our own terms and just get it out there somehow. But
That's a
that's
genuine problem. You're right. You have to make sure that our terms are defined, because otherwise they can go running off with it. Because you're right, authentic self is something that's used all the time with PTSD
mm-hmm.
therapies, and you have to define what that means precisely. Another one I have to do a lot is mind body dualism. So like Gnosticism creeping in these groups, where the
Mm-hmm.
the flesh is always the problem and the spirit is always the good part, and so the flesh is constantly being abused, but that in orthodoxy they're intertwined. We're embodied spirits, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have to fight against, as much as I love C.S. Lewis, you have to fight against the whole, where we're not just a spirit that has a body, that quote.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we are embodied spirits. They're intertwined and they have an interplay. And so, but just correcting stuff like that, they're like, oh yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's okay. So
Yeah.
yeah, no, that's what education. Absolutely.
Yes.
Education the whole time.
Well, and speaking of terms, I wanted to touch on the term religious abuse, which
Okay.
people can use religious trauma, spiritual abuse. All of these can be used semi interchangeably. They're not necessarily all exactly the same.
Right.
But generally speaking, there's confusion around this term. So sometimes
Yes.
it gets confused with, from what I've seen, it gets confused with discipline or conviction, or
Mhm.
simply not liking what was heard.
Exactly.
So, and we can see that in the greater church at large, as in, the big C church. So that gets in the way of providing them the necessary supports that someone needs who has suffered genuine abuse. So,
Yes.
how would you respond to this? How can someone distinguish between these two, what I would say are very different experiences?
Yes. So this is not going to be a comprehensive definition, because I'm still working on it.
Mhm.
But one of the things that you can make a distinction between is the person who gave the statement you didn't like, are they getting anything out of it for themselves? Are they repeating a doctrine that is actually established doctrine that you can look at historically, and they're just pointing at a doctrine and you're like, oh, I don't like that? Because that's different than if they're saying something to you using spiritual terminology or pressure that is also something that they're getting out of it. Like, are they pressuring you in such a way spiritually to have sex with them? Are they pressuring you in such a way spiritually to get you to give them money? Are they pressuring you in such a way to gain power over you in a way that it can actually be pointed at, right? It's more than just, this made me uncomfortable for a minute. It's that an actionable thing was achieved by the person doing the pressuring. So I've noticed that there's a distinction there about outcome, right? And then on top of that, like conviction, internal conviction, that's something that's between you and the spiritual realm. It's not between you and the person in front of you. So let's assume that the guru in these cases, and I use guru in a loose sense, like the spiritual leader that is informing you of something that you need, right? Or you think you need. That could be a preacher, that could be a shaman, it could be anything really. This person who is claiming to have some type of spiritual knowledge that's special, that you don't have access to, that's the person that you want to focus on. What's the purpose of them claiming that, and what are they doing with it? Because in Christianity, there is no special knowledge. You have access to all of the same knowledge as all of the teachers who are quote unquote called to teach. There's no secret. So if you're outside of Christian circles, we can deal with that context a little bit differently. But since most of the religious trauma cases that I'm dealing with are all the Christian oriented ones, that's the first red flag, is any type of secret knowledge that could be used to gain XYZ over you, and they're pursuing it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So then out past that, I mean, we can get more nuance. This is why the details matter so much. When people text me or they'll email me, be like, is this group a cult? Like I need, unless it's super obvious, or they put up a theological statement that is super obvious, it breaks with Orthodox Christianity, that would be a theological cult versus something that would be like quote unquote a damaging cult. And that's where that bite model comes in. Sometimes it can be both. Sometimes it can be neither. So I just need the details really do matter in these scenarios. It's hard to say something is a cult, capital C, damaging, stay away from it, without those details, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And then when I think of, say, examples that are in the mainstream church, so TC Cannon has been very, upfront about her experience. And so I think she's someone who I can safely reference. So she had an experience within a church she had attended for 25 plus years. And that was something that she would say was religious abuse. And I would agree with that. I agree with the application. So I'm not sure how familiar you are with her story.
I'm not.
Okay. So ultimately, to keep it short, basically she ended up, it was long and it was awful. And the pastor was just ultimately much more concerned about his appearance than actually handling things well, which is some things we could run into anywhere.
Yes.
That certainly comes up. We're more concerned about our pride, our prestige, than we are in taking accountability and how we're going to treat people and things like that. And so out of stories such as that, because I know you and I personally more so focus in the bite model area, in that more cultish area, versus personally more so focusing in religious trauma, which is where beEmboldened as an organization focuses, but it's not as much where I sit in my one-on-one practice. I know that's the same for you. Yeah. So when I look at these more mainstream church experiences, something else that I like to bring into play when we're looking at, well, did someone just not like what they heard because they don't like the answer? Or was there actually a problem with it? Of course, we're looking at, does it align with scripture or not, first and foremost. Even if it does, though, I like to have people consider the approach that was used, because something can be said correctly and not be said in a 1 Corinthians 13 way, not be said, be said as that clanging cymbal or clanging gong versus said in love. Now, and that is something still to apologize for. If we have a poor approach, we still want to address that. We want to apologize and seek reconciliation. And so I just was curious if you have any comments in that area.
I think it's so hairy. Isn't it hard? So yes, I've dealt, so I'm trying to think of cases recently. so I've had, okay, I can think of one that I've got a recent case, where it really wasn't a cult on a bite level sense, and it wasn't one theologically, but what had happened was the leadership was so immature in they were new converts.
Mhm.
So, and they had set themselves up as leaders, and this they had self-elected to do so, which was another thing. There was no accountability or oversight, which can be really, really problematic. They didn't have an eldership framework by which we could judge the competency and character of the people who were claiming to be leaders,
Mhm.
in like a First Timothy and Titus type of way. And so it was basically a really successful gathering of baby Christians. And there was a lot of kind of what you described, just a lot of personality and less, 1 Corinthians 13 going on with the teachings. And then the teachings they got like too into people's private lives, the teachers, and they were trying to dictate the details of relationships that is not outlined specifically by scripture. And I would say in these cases, even though it wasn't a cult, um, and even though it wasn't technically theologically unsound yet, it was so immature that it was actually abusive, that the people who were claiming to be teachers were claiming to be teachers. So this would be one of those cases where, as a Christian, I would look at it and go, you want to look in the community and you want to hear the people claiming that they're having these experiences and take them seriously and try to go, okay, does that mean that you ask spiritual leaders who are more mature in the community to intervene, like goes as a brother to these leaders and say, hey, like this, we need to talk about the fact that you're going too far too fast. I get that you're new, but here's where wisdom needs to come in, and here's why maybe you should slow down on the claiming authority. Maybe don't take the title apostle yet. You were baptized last weekend. Like it's not, this isn't, you get these guys, you get these cases, but in that sense, like, okay, can I point to part of scripture that outlines precisely what to do? I can point to parts where more mature brothers are supposed to go and speak directly with the people and air their grievance. But like, what do you do in that exact scenario? As a Christian just practicing in the community, I would tell people, hey, yes, you experienced something that is getting real close to spiritual abuse, probably shouldn't have occurred. You're owed an apology. And we'll see what we can do. And then if the people who are actually in charge, who are doing these things, are really Christians, the idea is that they'll respond well to
Mhm.
that correction. And if they don't, that's a red flag that perhaps it was a false conversion. So
Mhm.
again, these are things though, you have to take them on the ground. I don't know how to do this in like a formulaic way.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yes, it's still so relational.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And it's not,
absolutely.
the sad part is that a lot of times those experiences though will be isolated by people outside of Christianity as instances for why all of Christianity is that way, which
Mhm.
is not in even remotely true.
Mm-mm. Right.
So
No, it's
yeah,
not.
I don't know what else to do except go, yes, affirm where it's truthfully, this is something that you're owed an apology. And let's not respond unnecessarily. Like let's not blow this out of proportion either. Let's
Mhm.
see how they respond.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, and I've seen examples where people they haven't responded well and they've
Right.
maintained it and instead they've retaliated. It's like, okay, well, now we know.
Now we know you run.
Yeah.
Time to leave.
Yeah. Yeah. Get
Yep.
away. There isn't gonna there at least for now, the
Mhm.
door is not open for this to change. And so then it's okay. Then maybe we take a look at warning others so they don't get involved. And what do we now need to do with this information?
Yeah.
But again, just different ways to look at a term that can be applied in various scenarios.
Mhm.
And it's not always the doctrine that's a problem. So again, going back to the bite model,
Right.
we're looking at different forms of control. The doctrine might even be good.
Right.
So
Right.
so
Right.
yeah, it can look different for different people. But with all of that in mind, when we're thinking about what someone has gone through when they have had a true religiously abusive experience, what are some best practices that you use for engaging with an individual, from that sort of micro level, being like a friend or an individual church member, and then going up to a more macro level, like a church organization? What are some practices that you think are really great to implement?
Um, I do all of my sessions sitting on the floor. So that could be really helpful, especially if you've gone through something like this, especially for women. It actually works really well for men as well, but there's something about getting down on the ground. It lets them rest their eyes. It's a posture of service. Um, it makes people feel a lot more comfortable. It's less threatening. I find that's wonderful. It's one of those odd little haptic communication things that has worked just really, really, really well. We don't be legalistic about it, right? You always have to do therapy on the floor. Like, no, like if you're that's not what I mean at all. I just it's something that I did. I invested in a floor pillow, one of those really big, awesome floor pillows, and I
Mhm.
sit on the ground and they sit on the couch and get comfortable and do whatever. Weirdly, that has been really, really, really helpful. Um, Low lighting. So you make this, you want to make your environment less, what's the word I'm looking for? You don't want it to be like a doctor's office. You want it to be like your friend's house. So the environment being something that's engaging and peaceful, that's really important. Less, I can't think of it. The word sterile, I guess, is the word I'm looking
Mhm.
for. You don't want it to look sterile, because a lot of these guys are coming out of groups who are were already teaching that any type of psychological aid is a sin. That happens all the time. So you want to be mindful of those teachings. Even like medical anything is a problem. You want to be mindful of all those things. I will usually start with my experience with the group because it is pretty theatrical and pretty dramatic. And I'll just talk for a second about how difficult it was. And usually they open right up with any type of knowledge that you were aware of the fact that spiritual stuff actually occurs and that it's real and that you're not kooky and you don't have to be afraid. That's really, really wonderful. And then full transparency. So making sure they know that full transparency or not at all, basically. Like, don't talk to me about whatever you feel you're comfortable talking to me about, but I want you to know from me, you will be getting full transparency no matter what. And so I'll actually lay my notes down on the ground so that they can see what's happening. So yeah,
Mhm.
what their view is somebody on the floor with all of the stuff exposed so that they know they're not being taken advantage of. There's no magic going on. There's no weird like clinical sleight of hand, anything that they would have been possibly taught in the group about what this experience is going to be like. I want to thwart up front immediately. Um,
Yes. And
that's important. Yeah.
it's the only chance at building trust,
Yes.
because that doesn't exist. I mean, it's tied for number one from what I hear and from what I experience is, I don't know if I can ever trust anyone again.
Huge.
Oh.
Intimacy, building any type of relationship, being able to communicate, opening up. Yeah. And they can be imprisoned for a very long time in their own heads that they did to themselves because they don't even know how to respond to input
Mhm.
anymore. Um, and just, yeah, I mean, just anticipating those objections and saying all the things that I suspect happens in groups that I normally deal with. And they'll be like, oh my gosh, that's me.
Mhm.
So you're just showing them that it exists before they ever open up their mouths so that they know you know what you're talking about.
Mhm.
Yeah.
If you were talking to someone right now who is a friend, so, or a church member who met someone who came in as like, and heard a little bit of their story, or a church leader who just heard someone's story, do you have any sort of words of wisdom or suggestion on what would be something they could do to support this person well, as they're hopefully handing them off as well for more additional help if needed?
hmm Knowing the difference between somebody needing to vent, to just talk for a second, just like communicate for a second with somebody who will actually listen, versus trying to fix what occurred. And if you can't tell the difference, being open enough and honest and humble enough to say, how can I serve you right now? Do you need somebody to talk to? Or do you need somebody to really actively help fix this right now? Or is it some combination of the two? And let them tell you. And then respond in kind. So complete and total service in that regard. The other thing that I warn people against is when you're dealing, if you're dealing in a similar religious scenario, so you're a believer in the religion that they claim to have been abused in,
Mhm.
and they're going through their theology, to not respond to their pain and their suffering with, well, let me tell you how you could have done that differently, or let me tell you how you shouldn't respond. Like if they're throwing out Jesus right now, they just don't, they're completely deconstructing because they experienced trauma in a Christian setting,
Mhm.
and you're a Christian. Do not respond with, well, maybe the guru thought differently, or maybe they were like, no speculating, just listen.
Mhm.
They're just listen to what actually occurred. It's okay if you don't fix the theology right then and there. Like, just listen. It takes time, and that's normally a process, and that's the last thing they need to hear is, I was abused, but the only thing you're prioritizing is the fact that I didn't articulate the Trinity correctly.
Mhm.
That they need to see the Christian prioritize what actually happened accurately, and that is, we need to fix that you were hurt first. Then we'll talk about the theology.
Mm. And Anna, that might actually be a great second conversation for us to have, is talking to fellow believers and giving them permission to not have to give that theological correction,
Right.
because people can feel as if they can go home. And I've heard people say, well, I feel like I didn't do right by Jesus, or like I didn't do what I was supposed to do, or I didn't give the correct answer, or I didn't. And so again, that might be a good follow-up conversation to have, or we
Sure.
go deeper into that, because it's similar to when I tell clients, hey, taking a step forward can be pressing pause.
Hmm.
Sometimes we need to just take a few days and be where we are, and just let ourselves sit with that, and
Hmm.
not be so active in our healing. That can actually propel us forward. That can be active in its inactivity, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
And so it can be similar to that, letting someone be heard, hearing them, standing next to them in that pain and the suffering of what they just shared.
Hmm.
That is showing Christ
Hmm.
without speaking doctrine and theology. And
Hmm.
so thank you so much for touching base on that. The last question that I'd love to leave us with as we wrap up would be, what words of encouragement do you have for a listener who is somewhere in their healing journey right now? For those people who are like, they're just in it, in the really tough time of getting through some of that initial processing, what would you say to encourage them?
What you have experienced is awful, but please know that what you've experienced has given you a level of discernment and an ability to articulate yourself and communicate with others in a way that the rest of us who have not gone through that will never possess. It's a wonderful, wonderful gift that you can give to so many hurting people, because all they need to know is that there's somebody who's been where you are and has come through it and has gone through healing and has experienced these real things, that you can say, I've been there and I can help you. And it's wonderful. You speak at a level and a depth to them on with a spiritual knowledge that people who haven't been through that will never have. And it's a huge gift. Please just tell your story. Just keep talking about it. That's the best possible thing you can do.